Say the name John Calvin, and people picture arguments, predestination, debate. A man with a quill in one hand and a list of who's in and who's out in the other. But that's not how Calvin saw himself, and it's not how his story began. Because behind the controversy was actually a quiet scholar, exiled, fragile, and absolutely captivated by the majesty of God. Born in France in 1509, Calvin was trained as a lawyer. Disciplined, brilliant, methodical. But when the Reformation swept across Europe, he couldn't escape it. His life was interrupted by grace. And he described it simply as a heart made teachable by God. And so from exile, he began to write. It wasn't to argue, but to adore. His goal wasn't to win debates, but to awaken wonder. And the book he wrote, The Institutes of the Christian Religion, wasn't meant to be a system, but a meditation on the glory of a God who reigns over everything and wastes nothing. Calvin believed that the starting point of faith wasn't fear. It was awe. True wisdom, he said, consists in two things: the knowledge of God and the knowledge of ourselves. In that single line, it's simple, quiet, and almost whispered, it became the foundation for everything that followed. For Calvin, theology didn't begin with curiosity, it began with awe. He believed the starting point of all wisdom, it wasn't a question, but a realization that everything we are, everything we see, exists within the blazing presence of a God who already knows us. And the first step towards knowing anything about God, he said, is realizing we stand in his light, not the other way around. We don't study God as an object. We awaken to the reality that we are being seen. Man never achieves a clear knowledge of himself, Calvin wrote, unless he has first looked upon God's face. For Calvin, the human problem wasn't ignorance, it was illusion, the quiet lie that we can understand ourselves without reference to our Creator. We look into the mirror and think we're seeing clearly, but until that mirror catches the reflection of God's glory, we're staring at shadows. And so he believed that every act of true learning begins in humility, that the more clearly we see God's greatness, the more clearly we understand our smallness, but it's not the kind of smallness that shames. It's the kind that sets us free. Because when God is this big, life no longer depends on our control. And Calvin, he looked at the Renaissance optimism of his age, the celebration of reason, the cult of progress, and he saw something fragile underneath. A world that was just dazzled by its own brilliance, but it was blind to its source. And so, in a century that was bursting with new ideas, inventions, and art, Calvin discerned a subtle danger: that humanity might fall in love with its reflection and forget the light that made it visible. He called it idolatry, not just statues or shrines, but the architecture of the heart, that man's nature is a perpetual factory of idols. And so we don't just reject God, and this is one of his key points, we constantly replace him with success, with intellect, with relationships, with ourselves. And our hands may build churches, but our hearts are always building golden calves. And the point of that line wasn't condemnation, it was compassion. Calvin wasn't trying to mock human weakness, he was naming it so that ultimately grace could heal it. And he saw sin not as rebellion for rebellion's sake, but as a kind of blindness, a world groping for light it no longer knows how to see. And in that light, theology wasn't about mapping heaven, it was about seeing earth truthfully. Because Calvin wanted people to look around at their lives, their suffering, their longings, and see all of it through the lens of divine majesty. To know God, he said, is to finally see the world as it truly is, luminous, fragile, dependent, yet held together by unseen mercy. For Calvin, the sovereignty of God wasn't a threat to human freedom, it was the anchor of it. Because if every breath is sustained by grace, then no moment is meaningless. And he refused the idea that the universe was just a random collision of forces or that human suffering was a cosmic accident. The God who governs galaxies, he said, also governs your tomorrow, not with indifference, but with intention. And that's what he meant by providence. It wasn't fatalism, but the profound comfort of being known. He once wrote that the same hand that governs the stars governs your life. Think about it. The same God who spoke constellations into motion is tracing meaning through the details of your story. Calvin wasn't writing this from comfort. He was a refugee, a man who had fled his homeland under threat of death. He suffered chronic illness and loneliness, buried his wife and son. And yet through it all, he never lost his conviction that every thread of his life was woven into something vast and good. Providence for Calvin wasn't a doctrine to debate. It was simply a lullaby for the weary. The knowledge of God gave him rest. It meant he didn't have to understand everything because he trusted the one who did. And so for Calvin, faith wasn't about certainty. Rather, it was about surrender. That standing in God's light, it doesn't give us control. It gives us clarity that we're small, yes, but never forgotten. And in a world obsessed with self-definition, Calvin dared to say, you do not find yourself by staring inward. You find yourself when you're found by God. That vision changes everything, the way we think, work, and suffer. And it gives dignity to the ordinary, and it gives meaning to the mysterious. To know God is to see the world re-enchanted, shot through with glory and grace. Because when you finally see that, you understand why Calvin could sleep peacefully at night. Same hand that governs the stars governs your life. And that hand doesn't let go. Hey, if you're finding this helpful and you want to go deeper for yourself, we have the Theology Made Simple course, which is going to teach you how to take complicated ideas about God and make them simple. You can check it out in the description, somewhere up here, and it'll be in the first comment as well. For Calvin, God's sovereignty was never meant to silence us. It was meant to free us. Because if every atom of the universe lives under his care, then nothing, not a tear, not a breath, not a moment, falls outside the circle of his grace. And that vision didn't make Calvin withdraw from the world. It had the opposite effect. It made him fall in love with it. The world, he wrote, is the theater of God's glory. And he didn't mean a theater where we sit and we just watch God perform. What he meant was that this world, our ordinary world, is the stage where divine splendor unfolds. That every sunrise, every kindness, every act of courage, it's a part of a cosmic drama where the playwright himself directs, sustains, and redeems the story. So for Calvin, creation wasn't raw material, it was revelation. That when you step into nature, it is Scripture's echo. Work was worship to simply in disguise. So he saw God's fingerprints on mountains and manuscripts, sunlights, and in sentences. Because to study the world was to read the handwriting of its author. And to live in the world was to play your part in his unfolding glory. And that's why, and this isn't always known about Calvin, but he built schools, reformed hospitals, and wrote tirelessly about justice, because he thought every vocation, from pastor, blacksmith, to mother, to magistrate, could become an act of praise. The glory of God wasn't confined to the pulpit or the altar. It was hidden in the cobbler shop, the classroom, the marketplace. When the cobbler crafted a good shoe, he reflected the Creator who called the world good. When a teacher shaped a young mind, she participated in the same divine word that spoke light into being. Calvin, he called it the sanctification of ordinary life. And in an age where holiness was often reserved for monks and mystics, Calvin dared to say that the mother wiping a child's tear or the farmer tending a field was as sacred as the priest offering communion, if done in faith. He said, there is not one blade of grass, there is no color in this world that is not intended to make us rejoice. And I think it's one of the most radiant sentences in all of Reformation theology, a reminder that grace isn't hidden in clouds or in churches, but it shimmers right in creation. And so theology for Calvin wasn't about escaping the world. It was about seeing the world rightly, that the heavens declare his glory, but so does the work of your hands. And for all his intellectual precision, Calvin's theology had always ended where it began, in worship. He never forgot that truth unaccompanied by wonder becomes lifeless, that knowledge without praise just becomes pride. For Calvin, to know God truly is to love him deeply. When we contemplate the universe, he said, we see sparks of his glory shining everywhere. That every one of those sparks, it's an invitation to gratitude, to humility, and to joy. So every time you forgive someone, every time you speak truth in love, every time you create something beautiful, you participate in that theater of glory. You become part of the story that began with let there be light. The stage is the world, the script is grace, the audience is God. Now, Calvin's theology, it sounds harsh when it's reduced to bullet points: election, predestination, sovereignty. But when you see what he actually meant, you discover a love story written in the key of majesty. He wasn't obsessed with who God chose to save. In fact, if you read the Institutes, he's going to talk about the Holy Spirit more than he's going to talk about predestination. He was overwhelmed that God chose to reveal himself at all. For Calvin, predestination wasn't about exclusion, it was about assurance. It was his way of saying salvation begins in God's initiative, not ours, and that what God starts, he finishes. That's not cold determinism, it's just divine confidence. That again, the same hand that hung the stars will not drop the soul it has redeemed. Calvin's life was marked by pain, exile, sickness, misunderstanding, and yet he wrote with a kind of holy peace because he knew the ending of the story. It doesn't close in tragedy, but it rises in resurrection. And that's the secret of Calvin's majesty, not a mind intoxicated with control, but a heart that was surrendered to the wonder of God. The God who governs galaxies also gathers our tears. The one who reigns over history bends low to hear our prayers. And when you see that, you understand why Calvin's theology at its best doesn't sound like a system at all. Rather, it sounds like worship. That the world is a theater of God's glory, and every day the curtain rises again. And the question is not whether you're on the stage. You already are. The question is, will you play your part with wonder? John Calvin has been called many things: a reformer, a systems builder, a heretic. But at his core, he was something much simpler and I think far more profound. He was simply a man who couldn't look away from God. Because he saw a universe pulsing with order and mercy. Every molecule was alive with divine purpose. He saw Scripture not as a puzzle to be solved, but it was just a window thrown open to glory. And he saw human life with all its frailty and fear as part of that same radiant story. For Calvin, theology was never an escape from the world, but a way of returning to it, eyes open, heart burning, and hands ready. To know God truly, he said, is to live before his faith, coram Deo. And that phrase became his heartbeat: to write, to pray, to suffer, to serve, all before the face of God. And maybe that's the legacy he leaves us. That faith is not a performance to impress the world, but a life lived fully aware of its audience. The world is a theater of God's glory, and today, wherever you are, the curtain has already risen.